This is an AQA Psychology GCSE revision session for Paper 2 Psychological Problems with a specific focus on the biological explanation and treatment of depression. To begin, let's recap what depression actually is. The International Classification of Diseases, the ICD, diagnoses unipolar depression as consistent of the following symptoms: low energy levels, low mood, changes in sleep and appetite, and decreased self-confidence. There are more symptoms than that which characterise unipolar depression, but the exam board only expects you to know and remember these four. The exam board also expects you to know how the severity of depression can be classified. 4 or more of the symptoms above would classify as moderate depression, but if a person has 7 or more of the symptoms from the ICD, this would characterise as severe depression. So we'll begin by looking at the biological explanation of depression, which requires you to have some knowledge of synaptic transmission. So this is an opportunity for you to pause the video and draw out a synapse so that we can label it together and look at how synaptic transmission is involved in depression. So in 5 seconds, my diagram of a synapse will appear along with some key terms to label on. So here is our diagram of a synapse with a number of different key terms which are crucial in our understanding of synaptic transmission, but also the biological explanation of depression. So if you have a synapse drawn out in front of you, you might want to have a go, if you haven't already, at labelling on the following terms: presynapse, postsynapse, synaptic gap, neurotransmitters, vesicles, receptor site, and reuptake channel. In 5 seconds, I will go through and annotate where each of these belong. So to begin, we have the presynapse, which is the left-hand side of the diagram here, pre meaning before and synapse meaning the synaptic gap, which is this space here. So if I labelled that as the synaptic gap and the left-hand side is the presynapse, making the bit after the synaptic gap our postsynapse. Within the synaptic gap and elsewhere, you can see little green circles. Now they are the neurotransmitters, which are the chemicals that allow signals to be sent across synapse and amongst neurons. In the presynapse, the neurotransmitters are held inside of vesicles, which is this black circle with the green circles inside to represent that the vesicles are housing the neurotransmitters. And on the postsynapse, you have the receptor sites on the postsynapse, and their job is to receive the neurotransmitters so that they can bind to the receptor sites and allow the electrical impulse to travel into the postsynapse and allow messages to be sent. Finally, you have the reuptake channel, which is situated on the presynapse, demonstrated here by the half moon, sort of maroon red figure. I will now explain the process of synaptic transmission and the role it plays in depression using the orange pen on screen. So what you need to understand is that the neurotransmitter involved in depression is serotonin. So serotonin is just one of many neurotransmitters. I'm just spelling it out on the screen for you now. Many neurotransmitters in the brain, but serotonin is the one that has been linked to depression. So serotonin plays a role in mood, appetite, and sleep. Now, the job of serotonin is to act as a neurotransmitter to allow this message to be sent, as you can see, binding to the receptor sites and continuing down the postsynaptic neuron. Now, if there is plenty of it, then the postsynaptic neuron gets stimulated enough. But if levels of serotonin are low, which they typically are in someone who suffers with depression, this will result in poor mood, as the message doesn't get sent from the presynapse across the synapse to the postsynapse. So depression is therefore a result of low levels of serotonin. Now, some believe that levels of serotonin are determined by our genetics, and others believe that our diet plays a role. For example, protein-rich foods like eggs contain a specific chemical that is an ingredient that helps promote serotonin production. So it may well be that depression is a combination of a poor diet where protein is insufficient or a genetic vulnerability. So that summarises the biological explanation of depression, and we'll now move on to think about how we can evaluate, consider the strengths or weaknesses of this explanation. So there are 3 questions on the board for you to consider. Each will help you to write an effective PEC paragraph, point, evidence, conclusion paragraph, if you are asked to evaluate the biological explanation in an exam. So I'm going to pause, and in 5 seconds I will go through the answers to each of the questions. So let's begin with the second question, with what does the term reductionist mean and how does it link to this explanation? Well, reductionism means that the explanation is too simplistic. Particularly, this explanation is biologically reductionist because it does not consider any other factors that could cause depression apart from levels of serotonin. So you can argue that this explanation is oversimplistic because it simplifies a very complex disorder such as depression to something very simple, one neurotransmitter. If we now consider the answer to question 1, we can use this argument of the explanation being reductionist and support it by this argument that actually nurture and a person's environment could be an opposing theory, an alternative explanation for how depression is developed. A person's upbringing or a negative event in their life could trigger the onset of depression, and this is an explanation that we will visit further on in the course. So it is a very good criticism of the biological explanation to use. Lastly, the answer to question 3, this explanation is useful because researchers have been able to identify the role of serotonin in depression. That research has been used to create effective treatments for depression and improve the quality of people's lives in the form of antidepressants. So I'm just going to put this slide on, which summarises nicely with some extra information the evaluation points for the biological explanation of depression. But we are going to now focus on this usefulness point here and the practical application element, because the exam board now expect you to be able to apply your knowledge of synaptic transmission to the work of antidepressants and how they can help to relieve depression. So if you'd like to take a screenshot of this slide for some evaluation points, now is your opportunity to do that. But we are about to begin biological treatments for depression. So here we have another image of synaptic transmission. Again, it's an opportunity for you to pause the video and see if you can identify what this yellow blob is here on the half moon crescent shape and how that might link to antidepressants and the biological treatment of depression. So again, let's take these terms. Pre-synapse, let's label that to the left-hand side. Post-synapse is the structure on the right-hand side. You've got your synaptic gap, which is the gap between the pre and the post-synapse. You've got your neurotransmitters, your serotonin, which is the green circles. SSRIs I will come back to give you an opportunity to think about which one that might be. You've got your vesicles and your pre-synapse, which house your neurotransmitters. The receptor site on the post-synapse, where serotonin binds to allow the message to continue down the post-synapse. And the reuptake channel, which is already labelled, which is the half moon shape, crescent moon shape, which leaves SSRIs to be this yellow circle that is binded onto the reuptake channel. So here is an opportunity to pause before I go through the explanation and just to consider what the role of this SSRI on the reuptake channel of the presynapse is. So according to the biological explanation of depression, low levels of serotonin lead to depression. So the aim to increase serotonin should work to relieve depressive symptoms. And the most common way of doing this is to administer SSRIs, which are antidepressants. SSRIs stand for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. The word inhibit meaning stop. So if you break the word down, antidepressants, SSRIs, work by stopping the reuptake of serotonin, which I will go and just circle in orange, by the SSRI binding to the reuptake channel of the presynapse. That stops serotonin being reuptaked, being reabsorbed back into the presynapse, which means that it remains in the synaptic gap and levels of serotonin therefore increase, which leads to more messages being sent and an improved mood. So if we just have a look at that using an image on the next slide. So what we can see here is in the original, the reuptake channels are open, which means serotonin goes back into the presynapse and less of it binds to the postsynapse, less of it continues that message. Whereas here, when those reuptake channels are blocked by SSRIs, serotonin remains in the synapse and continues to stimulate that postsynapse, allowing messages to be sent and an improved mood. Final opportunity now to pause the video and to consider some of these evaluation points and on the next slide and how they might link to the biological treatment of depression. So what we can see are several evaluation points. One strength here at the end of the continuum with the smiley face, demonstrating that antidepressants are quite easy to use for the patient, which is of course a strength. Then on the other side of the continuum, you've got criticisms such as it being reductionist. Now that's the same criticism we used for the biological explanation, so that's a very useful criticism to use because it works for both the explanation and the treatment. The effectiveness of antidepressants and the fact that they are known to produce side effects in the patient. So let's have a look now at some explanation of these points and let's see if you were able to justify why they are strengths or weaknesses. So the ease of use. They are easier for the patient to engage with Depressed people often suffer from low energy, so it is a better option than having to attend therapy sessions, engage with a therapist. Often therapists set homework for the patient to be actively working on, so it's a better alternative than things like cognitive behavioural therapy, which we'll look at later on in the course. Reductionist, again, assuming serotonin is the only cause, so it oversimplifies the way the patient is feeling, and it doesn't really address the negative thought patterns that a patient might have. So the word we use here is palliative, in that it addresses the symptoms and not the actual cause. It makes people feel better, but it doesn't actually get to the root cause of what is the depression and the depressive thoughts. Effectiveness, so you could argue they are effective, but they do take a long time to get started, and they don't really address the cause, as we've said. Research has shown that depressed patients improve with a placebo. So are these antidepressants actually as effective as they claim to be? And you can link that point of effectiveness to side effects. Their effectiveness decreases as there's dropout rates, because patients experience really severe side effects in some cases, so nausea, being sick, insomnia, not being able to sleep at night, and even suicidal thoughts, which is of course the opposite of what we want to achieve with these drugs. So high dropout rates, which limits their effectiveness. So to end, let's consider some recap questions. I'll put them all on the screen and I will go through the answers in 5 seconds. So pause now and have a go at these questions. So the neurotransmitter that has been linked to depression is serotonin. What role does serotonin have in human behaviour? What behaviours is it linked to? So serotonin is linked to mood, it's linked to appetite, it's linked to sleep and aggression. Any of those would be an acceptable answer. Is depression due to high or low levels of serotonin? Depression is due to low levels of serotonin. Why is the biological explanation of depression good? It's good because it has allowed treatments to be developed, and it's good because there is evidence, such as that by McNeil. If you go back a few minutes, you will find that evidence that has linked serotonin to depression. It's bad though because it ignores nurture, it ignores the fact that depression could be a result of the environment or someone's upbringing, and it's also very reductionist. The questions about the treatments. SSRI stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. How do they work? They work by binding to the reuptake channel on the presynapse, binding to that to stop serotonin being reuptake back into the presynapse, therefore increasing levels of serotonin and allowing messages to be sent, so an increase in mood. SSRIs are good because they are easy to use and accessible, but SSRIs are bad because they are reductionist. It's not just serotonin that's linked to depression. They are not as effective as claimed. They can take often 4 months to alleviate symptoms, and they have very bad side effects such as nausea, insomnia and suicidal thoughts. So often the patient will stop taking them, which limits their effectiveness. So that is the end of the session. Thank you for watching, and I hope you found this useful.